that it's a church which is totally centered on the gospel, in which the Christians learn how to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, how to love their neighbor as themselves, others as themselves, in their cultural context. Just 4 points. And to come back to your question, I think we lose sight of this because we add so many other things, and other things become kind of like models of what a church should be.
Welcome to Independence, the FIEC podcast. And my name is Adrian Reynolds. I'm head of national ministries for the FIEC, and I'm here in Poland at the European Leadership Forum. And I'm here with a good friend, David Brown. Yeah. Hello, David.
Hello.
Nice to see you. Yeah. And David, you are ministering in Paris.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
You don't sound as though you've got much of a French accent, so I'm guessing that's not originally home.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Where's home originally?
But home originally was the United Kingdom. I originally came from Somerset.
Okay. Can you do the full Somerset accent on demand?
If you want to.
Okay.
Okay. You know? Or you come from Somerset, well, there's all your apples grow.
Okay. But you've seen the light and you've crossed the channel. Yeah. How long ago did you move to Paris?
I moved to France earlier than I moved to Paris.
Okay.
In fact, because it was back in the 70s that I moved to France. I was in the east of France at that time,
right,
in a city called Nancy, which is between Paris and Strasbourg.
Yes.
And I moved to Paris in 1997.
Okay.
Because at that time I'd been church planting in Nancy. We planted 2 churches, and I was called to join the leadership team of our mission denomination in Paris. And I said, okay, as long as you let me plant another church here.
Okay.
So I planted a church in the suburbs of Paris.
So number 3.
That's number 3. And which brings us a bit to the subject of today. I was then asked to join a church which had been going through a lot of difficulties and needed what we call today revitalisation.
Yes. Was it called revitalisation then?
It wasn't then. I'd never heard the word
Was there a term used instead, or just this church needs help?
Well, I didn't even know the concept. I didn't know anything. Okay. When I arrived in the church, I said to people, we're going to have to replant this church, because I knew church planting.
Yeah, okay.
Which is a term which is still sometimes used today. Yeah. It's a slightly different meaning, but
yes. I suppose replanting feels like you're starting everything from scratch again.
It's almost everything.
Whereas revitalisation feels there's a bit more continuity.
Exactly.
With the past.
Yeah. Replanting may be using a church premises which have been bought, and a new church start there, for example, with new leadership and so on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And for those who know Paris, what part of Paris are you in?
Well, it's the northwest of Paris. Okay. It's called the 17th arrondissement.
Yep.
Which, to situate it, is north of the Gare Saint-Lazare. And I actually live right on the border of the 17th arrondissement, and the very first suburb called Clichy, because the church we revitalized, we handed over to a younger couple 2 or 3 years ago, and we started a new church plant in Clichy. But the strange thing is that I live in an area where I live in a block of flats on the 16th floor with a view of the Eiffel Tower from my office. And
you're not selling it to us at all. It sounds like a terrible place to be.
Well, I love it. But it's built right on the border between official Paris and Clichy. Right. So I could change from being to Paris to Clichy without moving, because I've got 2 postal addresses.
Oh, have you?
One side of the building is Paris and the other side is Clichy. Okay. But it's pretty strange.
Right. Well, we're not here to discuss postal addresses, although I'm fascinated by trivia like that. Yeah. But we're here to talk about healthy churches. You've written a book, which we're going to come to, Reconnect Your Church, based on some of the things you've been teaching here, and also working alongside our own Phil Walter, who for many years was our revitalisation coordinator before he retired at FIEC.
Yeah, he was a great help in me thinking things out. Yeah.
And you're very kind and gracious in that you acknowledge in the book that some of that stuff comes from him, and it's obviously pooled wisdom, isn't it? Yeah. We often think about revitalisation and church planting, David. They're means to an end, aren't they? Mm. And the end is a healthy, vital, living church. Yeah. Why do we lose sight of that as an aim, do you think?
Well, I think the best thing would be to define what I mean by healthy church.
Go on then, tell us. Yeah.
It's a very, very simple definition, so simple that it might sound almost too simple, but I was very thankful to a brother from Finland here who said, sometimes you need a lot of experience to say things simply.
Okay.
So my definition is that it's a church which is totally centered on the gospel, in which the Christians learn how to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, how to love their neighbor as themselves, or others as themselves, in their cultural context. Just 4 points. And to come back to your question, I think we lose sight of this because we add so many other things, and other things become kind of like models of what a church should be. Without going too much into caricature, when I became a Christian, I was at university at the time. It was a bit the tail end of a kind of church culture where everyone had to wear suits and ties, and the ladies wore dresses and hats. And when we went into the sanctuary, we didn't speak to each other. It was very quiet. That sort of, and organs were the only music. And this changed in the late 60s or 70s to what might be called classical evangelical church today, much more easygoing, casual clothes, guitars, and you talk in the sanctuary and so on. And both are models which can have their danger. The danger of the first model is that you feel only spiritual when you're on the church premises. And you see this sometimes when people visit a cathedral and they're very quiet and so on. The second model can be a danger because praise music has become so important that some people think that unless you've got a good praise band, or you're listening to praise music in a sort of headset in the metro in Paris, then you're not really spiritual.
Right. Okay.
This is a caricature. I agree.
We've just replaced one set of.
But we've replaced one set to another. So what I'm always pleading for is to say, if you've got these basic things of a healthy church, then it can be lived out in different ways in different places without necessarily following a model which comes from elsewhere.
Right. So tell us the 4 again.
Yeah, the 4 is totally centered on the gospel.
Okay, just expand that a little bit, what you mean by that.
Well, the gospel is Jesus who died for us on the cross. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul said, I told you what was the essential thing that I told you.
Jesus died according to the scriptures, was raised on the third day.
Buried, raised the third day according to the scriptures. And if you believe that, you are saved. Okay, a lot more can flow from that, but that is the actual essential thing. So when a person becomes a Christian, they become a disciple, but when they asked Jesus what were the 2 main things that disciples should do, he said, well, love God and love others.
So the greatest
and
commandments.
I think that the whole of the New Testament in that sense is relational. Because every other religion, there are things you can eat or not eat, or things you wear or not wear. But every commandment of God, in some senses, it relates to our relationship to him or our relationship to others. And the 4th thing of the definition is in our cultural context.
Okay, that sounds like something we need to think more clearly about, because that's not straightforward, is it?
It's not straightforward. And I came to that little by little by thinking of the way in which the church expanded from Jerusalem. So take, for example, Paul writes 3 or 4 chapters to the Corinthians about food sacrificed to idols. Well, to be honest, this was not a problem for the Christians in Jerusalem because there weren't any temples.
In Nancy.
Probably not. Or to give another example, I've talked to missionaries from Southeast Asia or from Madagascar, where ancestor worship is very important. If they don't deal with that, they're not dealing with a fundamental issue of their society. But in 40 years of ministry, I've never talked about ancestor worship in Europe. But we have other issues which we must be facing. And when I say the cultural context, I'm talking of 3 things, basically. The first thing is the local context, because a church like I was pastoring in central Paris will never look like a church in a village in central Paris.
Of course,
The second thing is the national context, because we all have so much history in Europe weighing on us, which is very different to Africa or even the United States, for example. All this history is there, and so we have to live with that history. And the third thing is a pan-European, post-European, post-modern kind of culture, which includes things like woke culture and all this sort of thing. And so to be culturally adapted means being adapted on those 3 levels, in fact.
So you need to understand your context in order to be able to be a healthy church.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now, what you haven't said anything about is size. So I think sometimes we labour under the misapprehension that in order to be a healthy church, you have to be a large church or at least a medium-sized church. Is that true?
I don't think it's always true at all. No, I mean, a good church is a good church, whatever its size. And obviously, let's say at a smaller village in the mountains in the center of France, you're never going to have a huge church like you might somewhere else. But if you're a smaller church, I think the danger sometimes is that you try to look like a big church.
Right.
So a big church might have a wonderful praise band or video projection and what sort of thing. If you meet in a village hall, you can't do that. But you can still be a church where you put the gospel in the center, where you love God and love others.
Yes.
And in fact, it might be in some ways easier because one element of the New Testament teaching comes back 20 times in different ways is one another.
Yes.
So in a smaller church, the one another might be more easy than in a bigger church.
Got you. Yeah. And actually then the work of revitalisation is about making churches healthy.
Exactly.
As much as we can. We need to acknowledge there's a spiritual element to that. Obviously, we're under God. Sometimes churches do have their time and do come to a close, but we long that churches might flourish under God's hand. And this is the revitalisation is about the part that we play in that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I guess, therefore, we have to say sometimes a larger church needs to be revitalised.
Of course.
If it's not following those four things, if it's not centred on the gospel, not loving God, neighbour, contextually appropriate, a large church is as much in need of revitalisation as an apparently small church that seems to be struggling.
And often people don't see this, but a church which is plateauing, it may be a sign that in some ways they need a new time of revitalisation, because often it's only seen when the church begins to go down in numbers, it can be an indication that it's not going well, but it's not the only thing.
Yeah. Okay. Now, we're talking about change here. Yeah. Change is hard. So, I mean, it's a Christian concept, right? We believe in sanctification, don't we? So we believe that we are being changed wonderfully, gloriously into the likeness of Christ. But when it comes to church life, change feels jolly hard.
Yeah, well, change is a very strange thing. I mean, classically, people said there are some people who are always early adopters and like change. Yeah. And some
people seem to thrive on it.
Yeah, and some people hang on for a long time. Yeah. The vast majority, I think, just we move little by little. And I think the problem sometimes is that churches haven't changed at all, whereas if they've been changing little by little as the time went on,
then you wouldn't need these big step changes, would you? Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. And thinking of leaders, how do we even go about assessing whether our churches are healthy? Because it seems to me that's the first question to ask. Yeah. If a church leader who's watching, listening, we're duty bound all the time to be saying, is the church where I'm serving healthy? Yeah. How do we go about answering that question?
Well, I think numbers alone obviously isn't a good thing.
No.
It can be an indication. I think we have to say that, because what do we want? To more and more people turning to the Lord, to have more and more people worshipping Him for eternity. But I think that it's more a feeling. Could I invite a friend to this church? Would they understand what's going on? Would they think it was relevant to their lives? Or would they think they were sort of moving into a kind of museum or something? I think that's the kind of question to ask. It's I don't particularly like the word relevance, because that can be misunderstood.
In what way can that be misunderstood?
Because people can sometimes think that being relevant means that you have to have all the latest technology or something.
Okay, I see.
The word I prefer is plausible. Now,
right.
I'd have to define plausible to you.
Go on then, have a go.
Okay. Plausible it means something which people will accept as possible. It's so something which is can be taken into account. So, for example, many people around us today would not even consider even looking into Christianity or going to a church or something. So it's not even plausible. I remember talking to a young man recently. He was about 30 years old, studied sociology. And he came to our church and said, this is the first time in my life I've thought of God.
Right.
So it wasn't even plausible. And the problem with our apologetics sometimes is that we're answering the question, is it credible? In other words, can we believe it?
Yeah.
But people aren't there yet, because they need to see that it's plausible. And May I quote a French philosopher?
It feels, David, it feels quite remiss to have someone who's immersed in French culture on the FIEC podcast and not have a bit of French philosophy. So yes, you may.
So this is, in fact, a very well-known philosopher, Pascal, who writes The Pensée,
I'll
which is
take
quite
Pascal.
well known. And he said at one point, what we must do is to make people wish Christianity was true and then show that it's true. And that was back in the 17th century, before the Age of Enlightenment. And that is a really insightful thing. We want to make people wish it's true. So, in fact, I mean, we're moving on to a little another aspect of the healthy church. But in fact, the only time that people are going to see Christianity is when they see Christians. And they're not going to see Christians in church because they're not going to come. So then we move on to the second aspect of a healthy church, where you get the right balance between what in theology is called the gathered church and the scattered church.
Right.
And the gathered church is when Christians are together. So actually, even if we're on a Zoom together, actually it's still the gathered church because we're together. And what are we doing? We're worshiping God. We're studying the Bible. We're praying for each other. We're encouraging each other. That is the gathered church. But even a very committed Christian probably wouldn't spend more than about 3% of their week in the gathered church. So the other 97% are being spent with other people in their life. And
loving their neighbours.
Well, I sometimes say that we've got 4 networks. There's our family in the wider sense, our neighbours, people we know in the community, our place of work, or for a younger person where they study, university or school, and friends and leisure time activities. And everyone has people they know there. And the important thing is to show that Christianity is plausible by the way we live. Or, to put it another way, in today's world, if someone wants to be, if you want to influence someone, if you like, to buy something, people go on internet. And I know my wife, for example, when she wants to buy something, she'll look firstly at what other users say.
Read the reviews.
Who are going to recommend. So we as Christians are users, if you like, of the Christian faith, and therefore recommenders. So the way we live is really, really important in these areas as Christians. Continue to be salt and light.
So this is the adorning of the gospel in 1 Peter, isn't it? That's the same idea.
Exactly. And what really struck me, because we're talking about a healthy church and people see churches where we're together. The only verse, I think, in the New Testament which tells us that we must meet together, Hebrews 10, continues to say to encourage each other and to spur us on to love and good works. So we're meeting together to prepare ourselves for the rest of the week. So that is why the church, I say, is where we learn to love God and to love others, so that we can be good witnesses, to do good to people, to love them, share the gospel when we can, all the way through the week.
So tell us a little bit more about the book, David. Why have you written it? How's it helped churches? Fill us in on the gaps.
But I think it's helpful. I hope it's helpful.
I've read it. It is helpful.
It's a book that came out of a lot of our thinking here in Poland, in fact, and so on. You mentioned Phil Walter already. Because I say that revitalisation are 2 things. There's the vision and then the implementation of the vision. So the vision is a healthy church, which is at the same time gathered and scattered. And I suggest even there's a website called revitalisation.fr, which people can go on. You can see the
bilingual. So if you are a French speaker only watching this podcast, for some bizarre reason, it will suit you down to the ground.
It's bilingual. So in the olden days, we would have called this a diagram. We call it an infographic today. So I say, this is what a church needing revitalisation must take on board. I think this is the vision. When I first started with Phil, we used to say each church should try to build up their vision. And we realised that was very, very difficult. So now we say, we think this is a vision of a healthy church. And you can take this on board. And most people are not very frightened by it, because they haven't yet realised the implications of it.
They haven't done the measurement yet.
That is the vision. why the book? Because once you got the vision, it might take months or years to be working through the implementation of the vision.
Right.
And that's what I'm trying to do in the book,
Okay.
to show how we can get there bit by bit.
So it is a handbook for change,
Well,
really.
that's the title of it.
Yeah, and well, it is, and you break that down into different dimensions: social, societal, spiritual.
Yeah.
Tell us why you've done that and what those divisions are.
Well, because having looked at what I defined as a healthy church, to love God, that is the spiritual dimension.
Right.
To love others is the social dimension.
Yes.
In your context is the societal dimension.
Right, I see. So I see how those three link.
Societal may not be as clear as context, but being a preacher, that means I could put three S's.
Yes, I
into
see what you've done there. I see what you've done there. Yeah. So that's French preaching as well as English preaching, is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It works in both languages.
Yeah. Okay. And towards the end of the book, also, you start to help leaders think about how to implement changes and thinking about a vision. What help do we need here? What are the harder things we need to grapple with?
Well, I start actually with the social and the societal.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. I start with the social because it's, in one sense, the easiest thing to do. That churches can begin to encourage each other to be hospitable, to invite their neighbors, to join a club and to have contact. So in one sense, that is the easiest thing to do. Yeah. The societal is when people are beginning to get to know their neighbors and talk with them, or people at work and so on, they're suddenly going to realize, wow, we're not in the same world. People think in a different way. So we need to understand what this other way is, not as an aim in itself, but so that we can have some point of contact. And I'll give you an example of that. A survey was done in France a couple of years ago by the National Council of Evangelicals about attitudes of people at work. And the finding that really surprised me was that 85% of the Christians said, when colleagues bring up issues at work, I don't know what to say as a Christian.
Right.
That is the societal thing. So it is why we now move on.
And that's not going to be any different in the UK, is it?
It may be the same. Yeah. So that is why in the third case, I arrive at the spiritual, because it might not seem the spiritual, but in one sense it is, for this reason. When we meet together on a Sunday, I would like there to be a better word than we've got. I know I've seen the word gathering in Australia, and I like that. But if we talk about a service, a Sunday service, most people think service, that means that we're going to sing, pray, and hear a Bible exposition. I think we need to do more when we're together. And I've seen churches begin to do this in France. I'm doing it in the church plant, where we add as well, when we are together, times of teaching on the world we live in.
Okay.
In a very wider sense. Because if Christians together don't get it then, when will they get it?
Yes.
They
and
may
if that's
go on
the fourth
internet.
part of the healthy church matrix, then if you don't have that input at some point, when are you going to be a healthy church?
And that might be the most difficult thing, because people might say, well, I don't know how to do this and so on. I think there are ways and means of doing it.
How do you do it in the church in Paris?
Well, I've been doing this actually for about 5 or 6 years in the church I was before, as well as the church now. One way is that I try to read a lot. I try to read about a book a week, and always have. So I try to at least present something. I may not be the total expert, but I think probably because I've got possibly a little bit more training, a bit more time, that I can give the minimum necessary to the other church members.
Right, okay.
But secondly, sometimes you can use other church members. I mean, I remember asking a doctor in the church to come and talk more about questions like euthanasia, for example. So you can use people within the church. Being in a big city, it's easier to find other people who can come as experts. If you're in a rural area, you can't.
Although that's where technology actually can help you.
That was the fourth thing I was going to say.
Something we've learned to do over COVID, isn't it?
Exactly. That was the fourth thing I was going to say. Even non-Christian TED Talks, which you may not. Some of them are pretty good. And it helps people to understand where you are. And then you can talk about it. Because if you don't do it together, people may not look at all, or they may go on internet and pick up some very weird and wonderful ideas which may need to be corrected afterwards, because everything is there available at a click. So I think this is very, very important to do this, and to encourage people to in their daily lives. And another thing I do in the church, this is based on an idea in a book called Gathered and Scattered Church by Neil Hudson, also published by IVP, in which he did a thing called This Time Tomorrow.
Yes.
And at the end of each service, I interview one member of the church and say, what were you doing this time tomorrow? What's your job? What do you like? What you don't like? Are you the only Christian? Are there other Christians? Have you witnessed? Can we pray for you? And so on. And this gives the idea to everyone, it's important what you're doing during the week as well.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. The last few minutes, it would be remiss of me to have you here and not ask questions about the gospel in France generally. So I think most Brits think about France as a holiday destination, or an opponent at football. We don't think about it as a mission field.
Or rugby.
Yes.
That's not the time to mention that this year.
So help us understand this. So, many people don't realise that there was a moment in French history when Protestantism really took hold in the Reformation, and obviously then Christians were expelled, and all kinds of difficulties. What's the state now? I think we think about it as a largely secular country where nothing's happening, and that's simply not true, is it? So
it's not true.
So tell us what's happening with the gospel in France, David.
Well, it's been tremendous growth. I mean, you talked about the time for 1 century during the 18th century when it was totally illegal to be a Protestant in France. So we recognise that we reckon that about 2,000 evangelicals in France in 1800.
2,000 in 1800. Right. Get that in your heads.
This sort of grew little by little through the 19th century, so that the point we normally start from was in 1950, we think there are about 50,000 evangelicals in 1950. Now, 70 years on, we think there are probably 750,000.
Wow.
Which is a lot of growth.
It is.
It's not spectacular at all.
Nope.
A lot of church planting. The way I put it is sometimes you're fishing with a rod one by one. It's not casting the net.
Not a net.
It's not the
helpful.
net. And all over France, more and more. And so little by little, evangelicals are being known. Two things which are interesting about this. The first is that there was a survey done about 4 years ago by both the Catholic and Protestant churches together on church attendance. And they based it on the idea, if you went to church once a month, you're a regular attender. Most evangelicals probably did more. And so the Catholics were sort of just over 3 million, and the evangelicals 750,000. So that means we're a quarter of church attendance. And the other sort of little anecdote, which really, really surprised me, I like reading, as I said. I was reading a book on sociology, France Today. Right. There were two completely secular authors writing about this. And at one point, they described a typical medium-sized town in France today. And they talked about its shopping centre and its garden centre and its bowling alley and its kebab shops and its evangelical church. And they suddenly added that at the end.
Interesting.
And that was
interesting.
I jumped because that showed how much now we're much more part of a landscape than we were. And that's really important. Really important.
Well, praise the Lord for that. That's country I love. So praise the Lord for growth. So this is Reconnect Your Church, David. You've done us a great service by writing that. It's a really helpful handbook, something to work through maybe with other leaders in the church. So thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. And hope you enjoy the rest of the forum here in Poland and safe trip back to Paris.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And this has been Independence, the FIEC podcast. If you've enjoyed listening or watching, do rate us and review us. That helps other people find us. Thanks very much.